Good day, everyone. This is Jason,
And this is Josh.
and this is J&J DBA Insights. We're picking up from where we left off last time, which was before residency, and we were talking about what we did over the summer. Um, but this time we're going to focus more on writing of the dissertation, chapters 4 and 5, which were the findings and conclusions and implications for management. So, Josh, how did the findings chapter go for you? Chapter 4, huh? That was kind of a beast.
So yeah, it was definitely a beast. Even like looking at, never look at page count, but like looking at page count, like it was a beast. And I knew like, I don't know, everybody always wants a mark, and with me it's always been, well, the right amount is the right amount. But when I did this chapter or chapter four, I knew that it was going to be long. And obviously, last episode we had talked about, the work that we had done, actually conducting the research. But then this chapter kind of led into, well, how do we talk about all that work that we've done, and like what did we actually find after we did, so we went through kind of our search process results, right? And then, the results of the critical appraisal of the data set, and I excluded X amount. For me, it was five. And then a description of the data set, right? So like, well, what did the article data set look like? Thinking about what years did I use, what countries and regions did it come from, how many authors. That's kind of a favorite of mine. I'd like to know, do we have one author, two authors, or three? Is there potential bias there? And then
From
kind of really
selecting
getting,
too many of the same author, right?
yeah,
What
yeah.
about what about significance of the different types of studies, like qualitative versus quantitative or
Yeah,
mixed method?
qualitative versus quantitative. Definitely looked at that, and for me, it was more qualitative. And I don't talk to my dissertation, but I could have some, I won't say assumptions, but I can, talk about like it's probably because there's not as much research out there yet on kind of HR data analytics integration. So right, like we got to start thinking about that, right, and theorizing about different aspects and components of it. So I would think that would start off more qualitative, and thinking about bringing in like theoretical lenses. And then, once we, develop, whatever theories or ideas we actually want to, right, go out and test them. Right. So then that's when we are actually start being able to get into measuring it quantifiably. So that's kind of my thought of why the majority of my studies were qualitative. But I mean that, I haven't done any research on that research. So
Right. Like for me, I ran into a lot of quantitative. Like I think the majority of mine, out of 40 articles that I ended up with, I think I had 29 were quantitative primary studies
okay,
that I drew from.
gotcha.
But that's just the type of research that's done in Japan versus the research that was out there for years. But you know, did you find any problem? Like, I guess this goes back to the data extraction table, but I mean, did you see any significance in or significant findings in how your research question tied into the qualitative side of the articles more so, or was it just the amount of research that was out there?
Well, again, my research question did focus on best practices, right, and
Right.
recommendations for the essentially the integration of HR data analyst capabilities. And if you just think best practices and recommendations right off the bat, right, it's going to be, unless they're testing that specific best practice, right, it's going to lend itself to qualitative, right. And I know when I did my search strings, I didn't say best practice, but I did HR data analytics. I have to go back and look at the different integration, adoption. But again, the research didn't, again, just looking at what was selected. I think I had, so either 38 or 30. It was 39 qualitative articles and then five quantitative articles.
Oh, that's like the exact reverse of mine. It's just interesting to see how
Exact
that
reverse.
happened.
And again, yeah, coming up, going through my master's, right? It was always quantitative, quantitative, quantitative,
Right.
right?
That's what. Yeah.
But looking at the DBA itself, though, right? Like the skill set we're learning as well is how do we quantify qualitative data almost to an extent, right? So it's kind of just the idea of we have this information that we're extracting from multiple different articles, right? How do we take that and then be able to explain that research to others? Again, because our research is qualitative, right?
Yeah,
The research that we're conducting right now for this dissertation process, which again, it's also weird for a doctoral program. We're different.
well, yeah. Well, let's bring it back to chapter 4 in our dissertation writing, which was focused more on the the results that we're deriving from our coding and everything that we did over the summer. And this happened. This is right before SOARS. This was after residency, where we really had some title changes, and I know my process had some title changes in it, but we were getting ready for SOARS, and we had to have those findings kind of concrete. And I know I derived pretty much three different main themes across my data set, but I wanted to hear what came out of your findings. What did you come
So
up with?
again, for me, there are essentially three different areas, which were the data, right, the organization, and the resources. And those kind of, those were in my findings. And then as I kind of moved on to talking about what each of those meant and began discussing my findings, I actually turned those into three pillars.
Mm,
Three best practice, pillars for the successful integration again of HR data analytics capabilities. Um, and again, within each of those, again, the data, there was, you know, had X amount of, articles that backed up the findings within, the data and the sample organization and the resources. And again, and components breaking down each of those as well. Like for the data security, organization, like a culture of analytics, leadership support, organizational structure, and then like resources, think things like cost and funding. How did yours end up turning out though?
well, I was just thinking more that the writing process, like when I was writing chapter 4, like you said before, like you have a lot of information that goes in there, and I was upwards of, I think, maybe 40 or 50 pages, and I had to really cut some of that out and move it to chapter 5 instead, which kind of ties into that. But the writing process was a lot different because in chapter 4 we have all those big citations of who you're talking about, which studies went into deriving that particular finding or supported that finding. And it really becomes, when you're rereading it and you're trying to read it out loud to yourself when you're writing, it really becomes a, I don't know, a word tangle in there with those long list of authors after uh, a supporting piece of your finding or something like that. But yeah, I pretty much had the same experience. I mean, when you're writing that, I mean, how many citations did you have total after a couple of those sentences, or did you
Oh, I
have?
mean,
Yeah,
some people had six authors or whatnot, six or more at times. Supported. I'd say like leadership support, right? Um, but again, in managing that, I think I found Atlas TI extremely helpful, right? Had I not had Atlas TI, like I can go in, right? I coded within Atlas TI, so I can see go in, specifically leadership support. Who said it, and obviously it shows the quote and then, and it shows the author, right? And I was actually able to export all of that as well. So I kind of played it, had a little bit of a system going in Excel too, where it would,
right.
populate everything. And then I set it up so it also populated both, both the in-text citations as well. So then I could essentially just copy it and pull it in.
Yeah, I mean, that was really beneficial. Like you mentioned, Atlas TI for me, I broke down each finding and the code from each finding. You can really see, like you said, for leadership, which authors contributed to that, and then you can grab the citations and bring them into what you're saying a lot easier. So yes, everybody out there, Atlas TI, learn Atlas TI now before you start writing your dissertation process, because yeah, it will definitely help you out. I had problems like speaking of problems with like referencing and moving programs over. I had a lot of problems with Mendeley this time though. I didn't so much before, like in what was it, 850 when we were doing the REA, the rapid evidence assessment. But this time when dealing with Mendeley, for some reason it didn't bring the citations in properly to Atlas TI, and then I had to kind of scrub or re-scrub through all that data and those citations to link those up. But yeah, I mean, your
Then
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I didn't have issues with Mendeley. I know what I had done in the past is as I put something into Mendeley, I definitely fixed it right then and there, right? Whether, knowing citations, so, like lowercase, on my article titles, except obviously for the first word or anything after the, a punctuation. But I did have an issue with Atlas TI where again, I Atlas TI gives you a page number of where the quote was found. So I started my citations on my page numbers quoting with what Atlas TI gave me and not what the actual article number was. So I had to spend last weekend going back and updating all of that. It took me a couple hours and I was like, rookie mistake. Like, should have known. It was going chapter 4, even though it was long, it was fun and it was going smooth and like and like that was probably my biggest hiccup. And I was like, oh, silly Josh.
But so when you were writing chapter 4, like me, like I wrote quite a bit, but did you find yourself actually having to move a significant portion over as well?
Not with chapter 4. It wasn't moved over per se, but I know, I worked with my dissertation mentor, and we did a lot of restructuring, moving around from here to there, because it's almost like you're talking to your search process results, description of the data set, critical appraisal, and then it's like you talk to your findings, and then in the next session you discuss your findings. So like what goes in what section of findings and discussion. So again, there was a lot of back and forth with that.
Oh,
How about your structure on?
I was just going to ask you. My structure pretty much stayed the same because, excuse me, I uh, I had what one of our cohort members, Robert, suggested was printing out chapter 3 to follow it exactly down the line. And I did have to go back to chapter 3 to, retweak some of the things in there to align with what I was writing in chapter 4 as well. So, I mean, just wanted to hear what you had thought about that.
No, yeah, again, I think it was just a lot of structural changes for me. Not so much updating information, but just structural changes. Move this here, move that here. So yeah, that chapter actually went fairly smooth. Had you asked me a year ago what was I terrified of,
Right. Well, okay. So going on to chapter 5, which is more the management implications and our discussion chapter, which to me, I felt like it kind of wrote itself. After you or after one does any of the chapter 4 processes, you really have this a good notion of what is going to go into your chapter 5 and where you want to take it. For me, as I was dealing with Japan, I was focused more on the societal, individual, and organizational aspects of work-life balance over here. And those three areas really kind of wrote itself and led into the implications for management. But for HR data analytics, I was kind of curious of where that would be taking us.
Yeah, again, in terms of looking back at the recommendations, I tried to obviously integrate them with the best practices that have been revealed through the or suggested through the research, and again, but how to actually operationalize it, right? So one of my recommendations was like, hey, do a data analytics maturity assessment, right? Like, see where your organization's at. Um, Another one is consider change management practices or considerations when you're bringing in essentially this new capability into your organization. So like when it comes to change, like what do you need to think about? So again, I proposed the idea of again force field analysis, which came up multiple times throughout my dissertation. And then the third recommendation was strategic planning
Hmm.
and planning strategically. And I say it
Strategic
and I look
planning
at it
and
and it's
planning strategically. Okay.
right?
All
But you
right.
got organizations that conduct strategic planning and then pretty much forget about it, or they might say the strategic plan, right?
Hmm.
But what happens when you bring something in between the strategic plan that you might again that you might obviously might want to find important, but like, oh, I want to bring this HR data analytics capability where you need to actually sit down and strategically plan bringing
Right.
in this HR data and analytics capability, right? And that's why I think that fits within the recommendations because you don't just start it up, right? I mean, that was pretty much my whole premise for my dissertation topic was the fact that going to organizations and they're like, oh, I want to integrate HR, this HR data analytics capability. A couple years down the road, they're spinning their wheels, right?
Yeah.
So again, finding recommendations that organizations are able to actually operationalize.
And really, you're talking about the how to implement those findings that you found, right? So it's like in my case, I would use like dimming, which is popular in Japan, like the plan, do, check, act, that cycle that with the
Yep.
arrows that go
Okay.
around.
Yep.
And you know, did you implement something like that, like a strategic plan per se for your findings? Is that what
So
I mean, or not for your findings, for
so
your
again,
discussion or management implications?
with that, again, I did propose so it's called the Delta Plus data analytics maturity model. But one thing I did do is I actually did a checklist that essentially, if you think about Excel or like a document, all the way on the left side, right, is essentially a question that aligns to well, each component of those three pillars I discussed earlier. So data, right? And it was like the question was like, does your organization have like a data, security process or procedure in place? And then, on the right, it's like, if no, or if no without explanation, like, hey, you should look into doing either recommendation one, two, or three or
Uh,
all three or or all both. So it's almost a checklist. So when go into a future organization, sit down and talk with them, go through this list of about 24 questions to be able to start essentially doing a gap analysis on what they may or may not be missing. And again, my research specifically didn't it didn't say every single component of these three pillars had to be there, but it's things to take into consideration and have conversations about that organizations tend not to consider at times.
all right.
Um,
Oh, I did want to ask, what was our answers to our research question? Because that was like a main part. I mean, really, what your question was, and the answers, simple, cut, and dry. Really.
yeah. So for me, it was again back to those three best practice pillars, right? So it is, the data, the organization, and the resources.
Hmm.
And, different this kind of checklist questionnaire that I came up. But my thing is like, let's actually pilot that, right? Let's go into an organization and test that, right? And then see what we can come back with. And again, and that's kind of we were talking earlier, qualitative, quantitative. I think this has the ability to turn into essentially a primary quantitative study, essentially piloting, this approach. So that was kind of one of my main focuses. Um, another is, focusing more on the individual and the individual level when considering the integration of the HR data analytics capability. So again, like what goes through an individual's mind and what might be some of the hiccups or barriers there when you're thinking at the individual level. The research that I had done just ended up coming out more at the organizational level. So again, more focus on the individual.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, the mine too was now I'm recalling is I was focused on the individual, the societal implications and the implications to the organization. And really, for me, it was the biggest thing to answer my research question was the implication or implementing more female workers and managers into the process, because there was a big gap between female workers here in Japan and the male counterparts. And the research, some of the research that I came back that was interesting to me was the female managers were actually more, okay with granting different leave policies and work-life balance policies to their subordinates, compared to the male, which, you know, if you don't have very many female managers, you're really not going to have this, you're not going to be able to
Yep.
implement work-life balance into it. Also, like certain policies and procedures like child care leave and things like that really, you know, help to reduce the main finding, which was, the reduction in this massive amount of overtime that's being conducted by normal,
Gotcha.
male, more of their male manager counterparts and stuff like that. But yeah, and for, like you said, for future research, I mean, we really need to, there'd be some, calls for maybe more primary studies on having female leaders in the workplace and how well they are able to implement work-life balance practice. But yes, you know, it's a big concept, and especially a cultural one that is really tough to to tackle. I think I chose a really big topic to go after in this dissertation, um, and it was tough to wrestle it to the ground, I would say. But yeah, well,
So you've got your 5 chapters, right? So are you done? Are you,
right, yeah, yeah, yeah.
or like obviously, like so. What do you think we're looking towards over the next couple of months?
Oh, for us, well, after Source, which was a pretty good Q&A session of where we were with our findings at the time before we had written chapter 5. But right now, we have them all. We have chapters 3, 4, and 5 consolidated, and in for our mentor's final review over the winter break here. And then what? Next semester, 880 will be in our winter season here. So we'll be going from January to March on 880, and really it's preparing our overall document, chapters 1 through 5. Rewriting, editing, going back, rewriting, making sure everything is in sync and kind of tells a story and logically follows that logic train. And then we're looking forward to defense, right? Which I saw a couple defenses over the past couple weeks, and some had some interesting questions that came up, and how they talk about how your theoretical lens really applied to your research and stuff like that. Did you attend any defenses?
Yeah, I did. And again, kind of the same idea and more. I had this feeling of and obviously like we have mind blocks and whatnot, right? But it was more of these more. It wasn't like philosophical questions, but they were deep, right? Like the questions were deep and really, essentially asked the dissertator, to really think hard about certain aspects of the dissertation that they had proposed. So again, you could definitely I won't say looking forward to it, but definitely know like the gears are going to be turning in my head during defense.
Right. And during the last residency, I thought I had a real, good experience with one of our senior professors that came in, and we were tweaking the research questions. So he kind of came in and he saw my research question. He said, "Well, you got this word innovative in there. How is this innovative?" Man, I drew a blank. Like, well, I was throwing that in there, so I really had to be careful on what words I was selecting for my title alone, let alone like the research question or anything else. Because
Yep.
just in the title, man, they're going to be ripping that thing apart and seeing, that you really are honed in on the aspects that you're talking about. What about inductive and deductive, or not inductive and deductive, but what are the variables? Uh, moderators and monitors or
Moderators,
mediators,
was moderate, yeah,
mediators
moderators
and
and
moderators.
mediators,
Yeah,
and then
and
probably
knowing the
also
difference
these.
between those two. I think we talked about that during residency, but I came away a little bit more confused than I was before residency. But really,
Yep,
when
yep.
I'm talking about the conceptual model, because they're going to go into and what I saw in the dissertation defenses was they really went into those conceptual models and picked apart the mediators and the moderators and knowing the difference between the two. So that's something that I will have to definitely go back and double
Yep.
check. How did your conceptual model turn out?
Again, a lot different. My revised turned out a lot different than the initial.
Component of
Initial,
chapter
right?
4. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously the initial back in earlier chapters was all combining my three theoretical theories that tied them up were my three theoretical lenses, and then through my findings, obviously, well, not obviously, but again, two of my essentially theoretical lenses did not show up or were not present, in the articles that came or that my findings came from. So essentially, obviously, couldn't include that in the final revised conceptual models. It was more aligned to my one remaining theoretical lens, which was again this change theory or change theory component of force field analysis. Um, and then integrated with the best practices. So, and the, three pillar best practices. So essentially
Mm.
it's three pillars: the data, the organization, the resources. Within each of the pillars, there's these, um, these
Layers.
driving and resisting forces of change trying to find this equilibrium.
Mm.
And then again, I kind of have on top almost like a roof, but it's successful integration of HR data analytics. And
Hmm.
again, the idea being if you remove one of the pillars, like, it essentially it compromises the structural integrity of the I guess integration effort. So
Of the model, or the
yeah,
house that
yeah,
you're building, the
definitely,
foundation.
yeah, definitely a lot different than which is than I thought it was going to be, which is great, right? Because again, obviously, I didn't know what I was going to find, right? But it's definitely my findings were unexpected.
Yeah, I ran across several unexpected findings to that note. Like I thought it was just going to be pretty much, focused on reducing traditional overtime, like this practice that in Japan you can't leave before the manager leaves that day. I mean, that's
Yep,
very common over here. And I thought it was going to be more focused on what those senior managers, how their approaches to management styles were. And really it comes back to this social concept of duty. It's just like this samurai mentality that has progressed over the years. That this you're there, and whether you're being productive or not, you just need to be there, kind of thing. Like I mean, it's really just a lot of that, sitting around waiting for your manager, so you show I am loyal, and
yep.
this duty and stuff that they go over here. It's very different social uh, organization, how they deal with it. But really, it's social and the manager support that really dictates my or some of the findings in my research. But yeah, it was definitely a interesting process over this last couple months, writing, rewriting, chapters 4 and 5. But we got through it. That's for
We
certain.
did. It's all a blur still. But
Very
a
much.
couple more months. Yeah.
Okay. I guess we have to land this plane, but thank you all for joining us today. This is Jason.
And I'm Josh. And until next time, absorb the knowledge.